forever and a day. As Roy drove his car over the bridge that led into Avon by the sea, he didn't know where he was going. The boardwalk was to the right-hand side of Roy's car. Normally, he would have expected to find people playing on the beach and every parking space taken, but the rain seemed to have driven most of the people away. On his way out of the city, Roy had taken enough time to figure out how to get to that general area from New York, but he had neglected to find the door address, and now he didn't know where he was supposed to go next. Part of him wanted to drive up and down every street until he found one that looked like it was being overrun by government agents, but that plan was impractical, and he knew it. So he decided to find his way to Main Street and look for a telephone directory. There couldn't have been that many doors in the area after all. He had just made the final decision to turn up one of the upcoming streets and hope that it would take him toward Main Street when one of the cars parked near the boardwalk caught his eye. Had there been more cars parked there, he probably never would have looked twice at the thing. It was a common make and model. The color was unremarkable. But as Roy saw the car sitting by itself in the rain, he couldn't help but think that he'd seen a car just like that before. It was the same type of car that Joe drove. Finding Joe's car parked like that seemed improbable. Roy tried to convince himself that it couldn't be Joe's car at all, but at the same time, he couldn't take his eyes off of it. It was a car, parked in a normal parking space, near a popular boardwalk, and yet the car seemed eerie to him. Roy had been to a lot of crime scenes in his day, and he found that they each had that same eerie feeling. A spot that would have felt perfectly normal one day was suddenly charged with the energy of whatever crime was committed there. Even historical landmarks had that feeling. They were important, even though nothing about them was particularly unusual. He couldn't stop himself from pulling over next to the car just to take a quick look. If it was his imagination, he would get a little wet and laugh the whole thing off. If it really was Joe's car, then something was very wrong. As he turned off his own car and stepped into the rain, Roy pulled his coat collar up and put his hat on. Before long, rain was pouring off the brim of his hat, right onto his hand as he checked the driver's side door of the car. It was locked. He could see that the other doors were locked too, as he bent down and took a look inside of the car. There was nothing remarkable about the car itself. There was a folded map on the front seat, but that didn't prove that this was Joe's car. There was nothing that did prove it to Roy, but he knew in his gut that the car belonged to Joe. If Joe wanted to approach the house without being noticed, maybe he would park the car at the beach. Normally, it would be hidden amongst all of the other cars, so even if one of the Germans did happen to drive past, they wouldn't recognize the car as Joe's. It would simply be one car in a sea of cars. The question was, why would it still be sitting there? What happened to Joe? Turning around, Roy looked at all of the nearby streets and the houses that lined them. Any one of them could have been the Door House, but he didn't see a German flag waving in front of any of them, so there was no way for him to know. He could start walking. He could knock on doors and start asking questions, but doing so was a good way of getting himself killed. No, if he wanted to find the Door House, the best way to go about it would be what he'd originally planned. He would go to Main Street, find the telephone directory, and simply look it up. As he drove his car up the nearest street, Roy found himself driving slowly, looking from side to side. He didn't even realize that he was doing it until 2 blocks in, and he imagined that he had to look like a cop looking for suspects. This was exactly why Joe would have parked the car at the beach. Forcing himself to drive faster and ignore the houses, Roy finally reached Main Street. There were small shops and restaurants lining the sidewalk, and even in the rain, there were a few people here and there. A mother, covering her child's head with an umbrella while getting soaked herself. A man trying to stay dry beneath the awning of one of the stores. A couple walking out of the hardware store and hesitating for a moment as they hit the rain before running into a nearby diner. The diner. It would be the perfect place to stop. Roy could get a cup of coffee and ask a few questions to see if anyone knew the Germans or had seen Joe. Restaurants and bars always were his favorite places to start looking. Leah kept Max in the hardware store for as long as possible, telling him that she didn't want to walk back to the house when it was raining outside. He had what they needed, but he wasn't in any rush to get back. If it were up to him, they would take their time with Joe and not rush into any extreme methods. But then again, what did he know? He was just an assistant. He was forced to make small talk in the hardware store, which was not his favorite thing to do. He didn't enjoy talking to strangers about the weather or where he came from. In fact, he lied about the second question, telling the man behind the counter that he and Leah were from Ohio and hoping that his New York accent didn't give away the lie. The whole time he waited in the hardware store, he thought about Carl and how tired he was of following every order. The reason he joined Carl's team was so that he could be a part of something great, but it seemed like his voice was never heard. It was a far cry from his childhood, when Peter would do whatever he said and give him whatever he wanted. He missed that feeling of power. Having Leah around made things a little bit better for him. She looked at him in a way that nobody else ever had. She hung on his every word. She made him feel like a man, and not just an assistant. Around the fifth time, the man behind the counter shook his head and said, "It sure is coming down out there, isn't it?" Max couldn't stand to be in the store any longer. "We have to go," he told Leah. "We'll get soaked. I can't stand to be in here wasting time like this." She seemed determined to stay away from the house, looking around the store, desperately trying to find some reason to stay for a while longer. He had to wonder why she was so hesitant to return after spending so much time tracking the place down. He had a hard time believing that it was all because of him, but she never gave him a reason to believe otherwise. "There's a diner not far from here," he told her. "That's fine. We'll go there and get something to eat. We can talk. Oh, we have so much to catch up on." Without so much as a glance toward the man behind the counter, Max led Leah out of the hardware store, through the rain, and to the diner. They managed to arrive just as a booth was clearing out in the back corner. He preferred the back tables, hidden from the rest of the crowd. They sat on opposite sides of the table. He made sure that he could see the door at all times. She was only interested in him, so she didn't care where she sat. As soon as they sat down, she took his hands and smiled at him. "I've waited so long for this day, just the two of us," she told him. "Why?" "Because I love you," she answered. "Don't you see that everything I did, every lie I told, was for you? Getting Joe here. I don't normally do that sort of thing, you know." Max narrowed his eyes and said, "I left you behind." "Because you had to. Because they keep telling you what you need to do." "I tortured your sister." "Because they told you to." "Not just that. I did it. I wanted to." She looked deep into his eyes and squeezed his hand as she told him, "You missed me. Whatever happened, you did it out of love." "That's not true." "Then what?" "I don't know. I just..." He trailed off, not knowing what to say next. Leah shook her head. Her eyes looked as though she could feel his pain as she said, "Look at what they've done to you. They've made you doubt yourself. They've made you believe that you're not as good as they are. They preach about the superior race and the glory of the Germans, but do they treat you any better than they would anyone else?" A young waitress approached the table and asked, "What can I get for you?" Leah smiled politely and ordered a sandwich and coffee. Max didn't bother to look polite as he ordered the same. He didn't care whether or not the waitress thought he was nice. She was working for his money after all. He owed her nothing. "We should go away," Leah suggested, still holding onto Max's hand. "We can't leave. We have work to do." "There is no work to do here." He could tell by the look in her eye that she knew something that he didn't. He was sick of people knowing more than he did. He was tired of people lying to him and manipulating him. He gripped her hand and gave it a strong, threatening squeeze as he asked, "What are you talking about?" Leah looked around the room to ensure that nobody else was nearby, and then said, "Annie told me something before we left. She said that I had to get out of there. People are coming." "What people?" "She called them the good men. Now, unless she's suddenly taken a liking to your methods, that doesn't bode well for you." "And you're just telling me this now? Why wouldn't you warn me when we were at the house?" "Because I honestly don't care what happens to Carl. I saw the way he treated you and Joe both. He's unstable, unreliable. Leah explained, and then her look softened and she told Max, "You could do so much better without him." "Without him, what do I have left? He's my boss." "Then you become the boss. We can do it together." Max was actually considering what she was saying. For so long, he could do nothing but stand there and take orders. He wasn't respected. He wasn't vital to the cause. He had dreamed for so long of doing something more. Now Leah was saying everything that he always wanted to say, and she nearly made him believe it before reality set in. "The whole project revolves around psychics. Annie and Joe were the only links we had." "Annie is broken," Leah argued. "How much longer can she last, really? And Joe?" There was something else that she wasn't telling him. She came so close to saying it, but she stopped herself and looked away. He could see it in her eyes. "What about Joe?" he asked. "It's nothing. It doesn't matter anymore. If it doesn't matter, then tell me." Leah took a deep breath and said, "You'll be upset with me. I know you will. But I had to find you. I had to make you realize that I can help you." "What are you saying?" Hesitating for a moment longer, Leah finally told him, "The newspapers were wrong about Joe. He's not psychic, not in the way that you're looking for. He doesn't see ghosts. He doesn't see the future. I saw him do it. He was lying to you, the same way I did when I first met you." "Then he had no ability at all?" "He can feel what other people feel, that's it. Every time you felt something, he used it to create his lie. He took bits and pieces of what we all told him and what he saw in the house, and he pretended to get that information from the ghosts," Leah explained. "If he got anything at all from them, it was nothing more than a general feeling. No words, no details, nothing you could possibly use to gather information. So, don't you see? There's no reason to go back there. Let them arrest Carl, and you can take his place." Max listened to everything that Leah was saying, and he couldn't believe it. Of course, he should have known. The things that Joe was saying, and the way he was worming his way under everyone's skin. It seemed so obvious. He started laughing. He probably should have been upset, but he thought the whole thing was funny. He could picture Carl in the basement at that very moment, pulling off Joe's fingernails in an attempt to get information, and all Joe would be able to tell him was that the ghosts were feeling sad that day. Carl seemed like such a fool when Max thought about it. But if they were going to do this, they had to be smart about it. They had to figure out how to handle the situation. There was Yuta to consider. Was she a part of their team? Of course, he'd be happy to get rid of her once and for all, but would his superiors be upset if he did away with her? Then again, he was running the risk of losing his connection to the project completely. Yuta was at the meeting, which meant that she would be handing over whatever information they'd gathered from Annie and whatever she had time to include about Joe. Once she passed it along, she would be told when and where the next meeting would be. If Max didn't get that information, his ability to contact the higher-ups would be lost, and his task would be made much more difficult. He couldn't believe that he was seriously considering this, but the more he thought about it, the more sense it made. It seemed right. This was what he had been waiting for his entire life, and who could blame him for what happened to Carl? He was simply running an errand when the house was raided, and he couldn't go back. Just as their food was arriving, Max nodded to Leah, and in a quiet voice, he told her, "We need to get out of this town." She smiled back at him and reached into her bag, pulling out a set of keys as she said, "I know where we can find a car." The World's Fair wasn't as crowded as it was the first time that Mary and Sam went there. Because of the rain, most people were avoiding the place, and only a brave few were daring to run from pavilion to pavilion. The sky was dark and ominous. In the distance, Mary could see lightning flashing through the sky. She could hear the slight rumble of thunder. It would only get louder as the day went on. Mary and Sam had barely spoken a word to each other on their way to the fair. Each was in their own world, thinking about what they were planning to do when they reached the RCA pavilion. As they got closer to the fair, Mary began to have doubts. She started to wonder if she should have stayed at the bookstore and waited for the call from Joe. Perhaps it was a bad idea for her to run off to the fair in the hopes of communicating with the dead, even as Joe was missing. But she couldn't sit there any longer. She couldn't be the helpless family member, standing by while the world fell apart around her. No matter what she did, she would have doubted herself, At least this way she could feel as though she was trying to help. And if something bad were to happen, she wouldn't spend the rest of her life wondering what could have been if only she had tried. Vasya was back at the bookstore now. Mary had made certain that if Joe called, there would be a familiar voice there to answer. Now the only thing that Mary had to worry about was figuring out a way to communicate with Harvey once they had him on the television. As they reached the RCA pavilion and went inside, they stopped to shake off some of the rain that had fallen on them. As she took off her wet coat, Mary looked at Sam, and for the first time she saw how nervous he was. She had been so caught up in her own family and her own thoughts that she hadn't even thought to consider how Sam might feel about what they were about to do. She put a hand on his arm and asked him, "Are you all right?" "Sure," he replied, trying to force a smile. "I can't even imagine how I would feel if it were Norma." His eyes met hers, and she could see that at first he was going to try to tell her that it was different. Somehow a person's own pain had a way of feeling unique and unexplainable. But when his eyes met hers, they softened. He knew that she just might be able to understand. "Joe's never felt her?" Sam asked. Mary shook her head and looked down at the ground. She honestly didn't know how she felt about that fact. "You spend so much time wishing that you could talk to them or have them in the same room with you, just once more, just to say goodbye," Sam said before his voice trailed off. It was as though he didn't know how to finish that thought. Mary decided to finish it for him. "But having them here means that they're not at rest, and suddenly you realize that you've been wishing them pain, so you have to let go. You have to want them to be at rest. But at the same time, you just want them here." Their eyes met again, as they each realized how similar their thinking had been. While they'd discussed their dead family members before, this was somehow different. It was more personal. It was something that Mary never would have felt comfortable discussing with Joe, because doing so would only cause him pain. She leaned in and kissed Sam on the cheek before telling him, "Well, at least we know that if one of us is crazy, the other one is too." He couldn't help but smile at that. Though the situation hadn't changed, she hoped that she had helped him feel at least a little bit better about it, because the hard part hadn't even begun. "We should figure out some way of communicating with Harvey," Mary said, as they started to walk deeper into the exhibit. "I mean, with you on one end of the camera and me back at the television set, we won't be able to hear each other." "We could have the questions set before I go," Sam suggested. "We'd each know what you were asking and when, so I could get his response." "That's right." They were just about to begin figuring out what to ask and when to ask it as they reached the television exhibit. There were far fewer people there than before, and the television that Mary had seen Harvey on was turned off. "Oh no," Mary sighed as her heart began to sink. "The rain," Sam concluded. "We should have known. We should have realized that they wouldn't be broadcasting from outside in the rain." "Then why not inside?" "All of that equipment, with the lights and the microphones and all of that, it would interfere with the exhibit inside the building, and for this number of people, it's just not worth it." "I wish you'd stop making it sound so sensible." Sam turned away from the television and looked at his watch. He said, "We could wait. Maybe the storm will let up and they'll get back to it." "Waiting is all we ever seem to do, isn't it?" "I think there's a bar next door. We could sit." "I should call the store and see if Vasya's heard from Joe." "The AT&T pavilion is next door, too." Mary looked around the area, taking in all of the conveniences around her, and then turned to Sam and asked, "Do you think they'd let me move in here?" He smiled at her, and if someone were watching them from a distance, maybe it would have looked like they were a young, carefree couple enjoying themselves at the fair. But Mary didn't feel carefree. She didn't even feel young anymore. Having her plan thwarted for such a pointless reason threatened to crush her. She was so tired of being so useless. They put their wet coats back on as they walked out of the RCA pavilion and toward the AT&T pavilion. They hurried next door, ducking their heads as though doing so would get them less wet. This theory did not prove accurate. By the time they reached the AT&T exhibit, they were once again dripping, and once again stopped to take off their coats before proceeding deeper into the exhibit. As she began to walk, Mary folded her coat and slung it over her arm, not paying as much attention to where she was going as she should have been. Her carelessness caused her to bump into an older woman, with such force that she almost fell backwards herself. Fortunately, Sam caught both women before any major damage was done. "I'm so sorry," Mary told the woman, trying her best to smile and act normal. "Never mind," the woman smiled back, waving her hand in the air as she continued to walk. Mary felt incredibly foolish and couldn't stop herself from looking around to see who else had witnessed that foolishness. Fortunately, she discovered that most of the people in the pavilion had more interesting things to look at than her. Just as Mary was about to begin moving on, her eyes found a woman several yards away who looked strangely familiar. At first, Mary couldn't identify the woman, but this quickly changed as the woman removed her scarf, revealing a large goiter on her neck. The pain from his hand was shooting up Joe's arm. He couldn't move it without clenching his jaw and his eyes filling with tears. He had no doubt that it was broken. There were footsteps above him, moving back and forth across the floor, but Joe hadn't heard more than one person in the house for quite some time. There was no yelling or stomping, just pacing. Carl was waiting for the others to return, but where could they have possibly gone that was taking them this long? Honestly, Joe didn't care. The longer they delayed, the more time he would have to get the drugs out of his system. He needed to get back on his feet. He needed to be able to fight back if Carl decided to try another experiment on him. As far as he knew, help was on the way, but he couldn't depend on anyone to save him. He had to be ready to defend himself and to defend Annie and the baby, should the need arise. The baby was still crying on the upper level of the house. Joe figured that as long as he could hear the baby up there and the footsteps directly above him, Carl wasn't harming anyone. He found it strange as he sat there on the floor, running through all of the possible scenarios and outcomes in his head, how detached he was from the whole thing. There was no adrenaline causing his heart to pound in his chest. There was no fear, at least no more than any other emotion. He had to wonder whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. Fear could motivate a person quite a bit, but it could also make them sloppy. Rather than spend the rest of the day debating the ups and downs of human emotion with himself, Joe forced himself to stand up and move around. Sure, the room was spinning and his arms and legs felt like they were made of rubber, but he had to keep pushing himself. He had to move around and get his blood circulating. His lips were dry. He needed water, but there was none in sight, and he didn't think that it would be a good idea to call Carl down there so he could ask for some more. Pulling on his chains might have been futile, but it was just about the only thing left for Joe to do, and it gave him a reason to use his good hand. With his first pull, his hand slipped on the chain more than the chain itself moved. He tightened his grip and tried again. The second pull was weak, but better than the first. Someone was in the room with him. He could feel eyes on the back of his head, causing him to turn around, but he saw nobody. If it was a ghost, he couldn't tell whether it was Harvey or one of the others, and not knowing who it was made him uneasy. There were too many ghosts in that house. The drugs in his system would have been bad enough with plain old humans wandering around the neighborhood, but he'd felt worse before. Years ago, before he couldn't separate the outside emotions from his own, Joe was overwhelmed by the hopelessness and desperation of his own neighborhood. That was in the city, with many more people than there would have been in Avon by the Sea. So why was it so hard for him to tolerate? Why did he feel as if he were drowning in the emotions of that place? It had to be the ghosts. When they came close, their feelings were painful, but he didn't feel that now. Did that mean that there were no ghosts near him? Did it mean that the drugs were dulling his senses? There were too many factors to consider, and Joe couldn't focus enough to even begin the task. He pulled on the chain, this time much harder than the first or second time. There was no fooling himself into thinking that he had all of his strength back, but he was making some progress. The fourth pull was less of a jerk on the chain and more like a tug of war with the wall. The wall won. Joe's feet slipped on the dusty ground, and he nearly fell back to the floor, but he stopped himself just in time. He dropped the chain, deciding that what he was doing was useless, and he began pacing across as much of the basement floor as he possibly could, while still tethered to the wall. His steps quickly began to mirror Carl's above him. As he paced, Joe tried to find that landmark of emotion that told him where his own feelings began. He conjured up images of his wife and daughter, and the night they died. He allowed the sounds of the rain outside to fill his head and take him back to that horrible night, and those emotions began to bubble up inside of him. He could feel the loss, even sharper in some ways than the emotions of a ghost, only these emotions sent pains through his heart rather than his head. These were his emotions, and the rest of what he felt just barely began to fade into the background before they came back with more force than ever before, drowning out his emotions. He should have wanted to scream in frustration and throw things around just as much as Carl might, but the anger simply wasn't there. Still pacing, Joe ran through everything that he could remember about his interaction with Carl, trying to remember how Carl felt and what his weaknesses were. If he couldn't feel out the situation in the present, he could at least try to act on what he had learned since arriving at the house. He ran through the list of things that he knew about Carl, that he was irrational but believed in his twisted cause. He presented himself as a man of logic and science, but his reasoning was flawed. Joe would have loved to call it a delusion, except that the center of Carl's logic was psychic phenomena, and that much of it was real. Maybe there was something that Joe could do with that. Maybe he could convince Carl that he'd had a vision or a visitation, and he knew all of the answers. Maybe he could keep Carl from injecting him with any other drugs or torturing him, at least until help arrived. But what could he tell him? What did Carl want to hear? What do they know? It was a question that popped into Joe's mind, and he heard it in Carl's voice, but he couldn't remember when he heard it asked. He repeated that question to himself over and over again, trying to remember when he'd heard it, until finally it came to him. In the days of his drug-induced surge of emotions, Joe had heard himself screaming the words, "They know." He supposed that he was talking about Sam and Mary, knowing where he was and that something had gone wrong. Fortunately, he never said anything more than those two words. Maybe that was what he could use against Carl. Maybe he could make something up. As he played with the idea of lying to Carl, the memory of his injection with the drugs slowly started to come back to him, and the rush of emotions that followed. He then remembered the wedding ring that Carl had placed in his shirt pocket. It was one of the items that he'd seen earlier. It belonged to one of the ghosts. Joe reached into his pocket and pulled out the wedding band. He held it in his hand for a moment, staring at every scratch and burn on the ring. It practically vibrated with emotion. He threw the ring across the basement, putting as much space between the ring and himself as he possibly could. And just like that, the raging river of emotions was reduced to a steady but manageable stream. In the corner of the diner there was a payphone, and next to that a directory. Roy went to the directory and began flipping through it, searching for the door address. It didn't take him long to find, and he was tempted to rip the page right out of the book, but a handwritten sign on the wall asked customers not to do that, so he copied it into his notebook instead and tucked the address away in his pocket as he walked back to the counter and took a seat. The diner was crowded, mostly with high school kids who had nowhere better to be since the beach was unavailable to them. They laughed and made a lot of noise, drawing the eyes of the young waitress behind the counter. She undoubtedly wished that she were one of those kids and not the person serving them. "What can I get you?" the waitress asked Roy, with her eyes fixed on one of the tables behind him. "Just coffee and a piece of pie." "What kind?" "Your choice." She nodded and walked away, taking orders from other customers and clearing away plates from other tables. As he waited, Roy checked the time. He wondered how long it would take for the government men to get to the house. They'd have to assemble whatever team they had working for them and get a warrant. That would take time. Then they'd have to drive out to the house. Since Roy didn't know who they were or where they were coming from, there was no way for him to know how long the drive would take, but he figured that he probably had enough time to eat a piece of pie and ask a couple of quick questions. Honestly, he doubted that the waitress would have anything worthwhile to tell him, so he didn't expect the interview to last very long. For starters, he didn't think that the group of Nazis would go around introducing themselves to the neighborhood. If they met anyone at all, they'd probably use fake names. On top of that, the waitress was young and barely interested in taking his order. She did not seem like the type of girl who would remember the finer details of every customer who came into the place. Names and faces would undoubtedly be purged from her mind the second someone left the diner. She returned with a slice of blueberry pie and began setting up a cup of coffee in front of Roy. As she was pouring, Roy said, "Blueberry, a fine choice." "We love our blueberries around here," the girl said with a disinterested tone, as though the line had been scripted for her. "I was wondering if you might help me with something." "I can if it's on the menu. If not, you'll have to go somewhere else." "I'm looking for some locals. I was thinking that you might help me track them down." "Oh, I don't know about that. How about I tell you their names, and then you can tell me that you've never heard of them before. That way we'll both feel more fulfilled from the experience. Huh? Roy was just about to try explaining his comment to the waitress when someone bumped him from behind. There was a new batch of customers who had just come through the door, squeezing their way past other customers and tables. As Roy moved forward to let them through a bit more easily, he glanced back and saw the woman that he knew as Annalise Meyer walking toward the door with a man who looked an awful lot like Max Weber. Only she didn't look like a hostage, and when Max spoke to her, he didn't call her Annalise. "Give me the keys, would you, Leah?" Max said as they passed, and the woman handed him a set of keys. Leah Meyer should not have looked so vibrant and full of life. He saw the room where she had been held. The chains, the blood. There was no way that the woman in the diner was that person. No amount of family resemblance could convince him that this was anyone other than the woman that he knew as Annalise. He never had the chance to talk with her for very long, but he could see how she carried herself and the look in her eyes. This was definitely the woman that Joe had come to Avon with, but here she was, smiling and looking happy as ever, and Joe was nowhere to be found. Neither one of them saw him, and he didn't know that they would have recognized him if they did. But there they were, just waiting to be followed back to the house. Government men or no government men, Roy couldn't pass up an opportunity like that. Joe's life might depend on his swift action after all. With a smile on his face, Roy turned back to the waitress and said, "Thank you. You've helped me more than you'll ever know." "You can thank me with a tip." Roy tossed some change down on the counter for the waitress, never stopping to count how much he was giving her, and he hurried out of the diner. It was pouring, and in the few seconds that it had taken Roy to get out of the diner, Leah and Max had already made their way to the intersection and turned the corner. For a moment, Roy considered getting in his car, but he quickly decided against it. There was no way for him to follow Leah and Max in a car without their noticing. If they saw him, they could cut through any yard, and he would be unable to follow. He decided to follow them on foot. He followed the couple down the street, keeping a safe distance and imagining that he might try to hide behind a bush or pretend to be walking toward one of the nearby houses if Max or Leah were to look back. After all, they were the only 3 people on the sidewalk, and it might look a little conspicuous if they saw Roy matching their pace and headed right for them. But they never turned around, and the sound of the rain washed out any sound that he might have been making as he sloshed through puddles and hurried across the slate sidewalk in his leather-soled shoes. Roy knew where the house was, and he knew which block they should have turned down if they wanted to make their way back to the house. But as he followed them across one too many intersections, he began to suspect that something wasn't adding up. They weren't going back to the house. But where? It only took Roy a second or two before the answer came to him. Lee and Max were headed toward the beach. It's where Joe's car was parked, and if they could make it to that car, they could leave that place and disappear forever. The moment that Mary recognized Yuta Dor, it was like a bolt of lightning had struck her. She froze, eyes locked on Yuta as she wandered through the pavilion, scanning the crowd. Luckily for Mary, Sam stepped in front of her just as Yuta's eyes were about to move in Mary's direction. If she saw Mary looking at her, who knew what her reaction might be? Certainly she wouldn't go through with whatever business she had at the fair. Mary didn't understand it. She couldn't figure out why Yuta would be there instead of at the house in New Jersey. "That's the woman from the police files, right?" Sam asked Mary, still standing with his back to Yuta so that Mary could look without seeming like she was staring. Yuta Dor, but why would she be here?" Sam shook his head and said, "Somehow I don't think she's here for the Polish sausage or the fireworks." "Do you think Joe's here?" "I don't know." "What should we do?" Mary asked, now looking into Sam's eyes. She could see that he was trying to figure out the smartest move. Mary's first instinct was to find a police officer and tell them about Yuta, but any sign of a uniform would cause Yuta to call off whatever she was doing at the fair. And if they arrested her, what would the charges be? There was no proof that Yuta was involved in any crimes. The closest thing that they might have was the room in her apartment, with the chains and the bloody blankets. But she could easily tell the police that she had an unruly dog, and who would they be to tell her otherwise? "We have to follow her," Sam told Mary, apparently reaching the same conclusions that she had. "Whatever she's doing here, we have to stop it." Mary nodded her agreement. She would have told him the same thing. except that she didn't want to have to be the one to make that call. She had no training as an officer or a soldier. She was just a waitress. But Sam spoke with confidence. Mary could see his mind working behind his eyes, but he didn't seem unsure of himself or scared like she was. He seemed strangely at home in this role. For a moment, Mary's mind drifted back to the night that she first met Sam, and how he had come to her rescue when Roy wouldn't leave her alone. She remembered the way he defended her, and how there hadn't been one moment of her time with Sam when she hadn't felt just as safe and just as protected. That first night seemed like ages ago to her now. It was hard to remember a time before she had him. He took her by the hand and began to walk with her, pulling her out of her memory. They walked slowly, and Sam led them through the pavilion, always keeping their eyes on Yuta while pretending to explore the exhibit and talk amongst themselves. He didn't let go of her hand, and she hoped that he never would. Feeling his hand wrapped around her own kept her from panicking. Yuta was walking in much the same way as they were, pretending to browse, while glancing around every so often or checking her watch. She was waiting for someone to join her, and from the expression on her face, Mary was assuming that the other person was late. They spent quite a while like this, as other visitors to the fair made their way through the exhibit, and some braved the weather and moved on to other buildings. Others were waiting out the storm, and it was a good thing, too. Had Mary and Sam been the only people in the area to be standing around besides Yuta, they probably would have drawn attention to themselves and spoiled whatever chances they had of following Yuta or discovering why she was at the World's Fair. Yuta seemed out of place at the fair, surrounded by people who wanted to be there and wanted to enjoy themselves. To everyone else, it might have seemed like she was annoyed by the weather, but to Mary, she seemed like the type of person who would never be happy, the type of person who would bring dark clouds with her wherever she went. While Mary's mind wandered and she thought about what type of person Yuta must be, Sam stayed vigilant. He put on his easy smile and had the look of a young man in love, but his eyes stayed on Yuta at all times, unless she began to turn his way. When that happened, he would shift his eyes to Mary and brush a stray hair away from her face, or pretend to say something sweet while telling Mary to react in kind. Once or twice, he simply told her that she was beautiful, and she never doubted for a second that he was being sincere. Then, in a moment where she was wondering what the Door Bakery must have had on the menu, Sam squeezed her hand and nodded toward Yuta. When Mary looked, she saw an older man wearing a dark raincoat approaching Yuta. The old man took off his hat in order to shake off the rain. He was a pale man, with no hair on the top of his head. What hair he had on the sides was cut short and poured down his face, forming a beard that had a subtle point at its tip. He had small, round glasses, which he removed for a moment, inspecting the rain on their lenses. He had no means of drying them while holding onto his hat, so he blew them off as best he could and put the glasses back on his face. He smiled when he saw Yuta and took her hands in his own, though she didn't seem to like him touching her. The man appeared pleasant. He could have been someone's grandfather, or perhaps a doctor. Doctor is what Mary settled on. He was a doctor who was conducting some sort of experiment on people like Joe, just like she had seen in so many books over the years. This conclusion turned the man from a kindly old grandfather type into a sadistic monster. His smile went from warm to disgusting in no time at all. "Who do you think that is?" she asked Sam, who was trying a lot harder to appear inconspicuous than she was. He shook his head and said, "I don't know. Another German, I guess. Not one of the men from the police files, that's for sure. Maybe he's their boss. For all we know, he's here to sell her a new recipe." "Could be. But they're meeting in a crowded location where it's easy to blend in. He's not going to her bakery or her house, so he probably doesn't want anyone linking him to her." "You get all of this just from watching them?" "I'm guessing a lot more than it seems." "You have me convinced." Sam turned his attention to Mary for just a moment and smiled sweetly at her. She kept her eyes on him as she asked, "Are they looking this way?" "Not that I know of," he replied, letting her know that this time he was looking at her for his own benefit. It was a look of enchantment that made her feel like the center of the universe. She was about to lean in and give him a kiss when his eyes shifted back to Yuta and the other man. His expression changed, causing Mary to pull away and turn her attention to what he was looking at. Yuta was handing the man a large envelope and saying something which the man seemed to find very interesting. For just a fraction of a second, Mary could have sworn that she saw the same look in the man's eyes that she had just seen in Sam's, and she wanted to be sick. "We need to get that envelope," Sam told her. "What do you think it is?" "Judging from the look on his face, I think those must be some pretty impressive recipes." The man kissed Yuta on the hand, which made Yuta cringe just about as much as it did Mary. Then he put his hat back on and turned to walk away. Yuta turned in the opposite direction and started to walk. "Who do we follow?" Mary asked, dreading the answer already. "I'll go after the envelope. You follow Yuta. See where she goes. Try not to let her know that you're following her." "What do I do when she leaves the fair?" "See how she leaves. Get a description of the car. We can tell the police," Sam instructed. He then put his hands on Mary's shoulders and looked her in the eye as he said, "Don't get too close. If she sees you, run in the opposite direction." Mary wanted to say the same to Sam, because she hated the idea of him getting into a fight with the other man. Sam didn't have a gun, and if the other man pulled a weapon of any kind, she didn't even want to imagine what could happen. She kissed Sam, wishing that they could stay in that moment for a while longer. But they didn't have time. They needed to start moving. "I love you, Sam," she told him. He smiled and kissed her once more on the forehead before moving away from her in pursuit of the man. Mary watched Sam go for just a moment before turning in the direction that Yuta rushed off in. Once she saw Yuta moving through the crowd, Mary began to walk. When he was 1 block away from the boardwalk, Roy found himself fishing through his pockets and looking from lawn to lawn, trying to find something that he could use as a weapon. Normally, Roy's weapon of choice was a pen. He would stand back and destroy his enemy from afar. His job was to remain an observer and never get involved with the story. Certainly, he should never become a part of the story. But there was nobody else around to stop Max and Leah, and if he allowed them to get away, what type of man would that make him? The very thought sent a chill through him. He'd never asked this question before. He did what he had to do in order to get the story, and that was it. What type of man did that make him? A reporter. But now things were different. Joe's life was on the line, and for some reason, Roy couldn't get the image of Mary's angry face out of his head. One of the lawns was landscaped with fist-sized rocks lining the flower beds. As Roy passed the house, he bent down and grabbed one of those rocks. He tested the weight in his hand, getting a feel for the only weapon that he could find. His instinct was to hang back and wait for something to happen. So as Max and Leah started to cross the street and make their way over to the sidewalk in front of the boardwalk, Roy slowed his pace and followed them from the opposite side. He ran through everything that he knew about the couple, trying to put everything into context since realizing that Annalise was actually Leah. The realization threw everything he knew about the woman into question. Her relationship to Max, her relationship to the real Annalise, to Joe. He remembered the stories about fighting and eventually Max kidnapping her sister. That part was still true, but why? If she was the one he loved, why would he leave her and take the sister? Obviously, the answer was because Annalise could still speak to the dead. The moment he thought it, Roy could hear Tubby's voice in his head, yelling at him for chasing stories about ghosts and psychics. Then again, he didn't work for Tubby anymore. And then again, still, running the story through his head wasn't going to help him with this situation. He wasn't there to report on a crime. He was there to catch the criminals. As they neared Joe's car, Roy crossed the street and started to walk on the sidewalk near the beach. He turned his head, so that if they did look back at him, it would appear as though he was trying to see the ocean. Never having done anything like this before, Roy was unprepared for how weak his hand felt as his heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure that he would be able to swing it when he had to, but he really didn't have a choice anymore. He needed to catch them. But then what? He didn't have handcuffs. He didn't have a gun to hold them with until the police got there. The closer he got to them, the more this was feeling like a bad idea. He was approaching them as Max fumbled with the keys and tried to unlock the door. Leah was walking around to the other side of the car. Neither one of them was facing him, so Roy thought that he might have another moment or two before he needed to take any action. But then he saw Max's reflection in the car window and realized that Max's eyes were already on him. While one hand was putting the key into the car door, the other was reaching into his pocket. The constant inflow of emotions from around the neighborhood seemed like nothing compared to the rush that he had been dealing with before, yet he was still having a hard time controlling those emotions and bringing his own to the surface. The medication was not out of his system, and it was hard to concentrate. He could try to picture his wife and daughter, and for a moment he would regain his focus, but then his focus would waver, and another emotion would explode inside of him, catching him off guard and allowing the stream to overwhelm him once again. His head was no longer filled with shooting pains. His injured hand was still useless to him, but at least his other limbs were beginning to come around. He was starting to feel more like himself again, which would have been great if he needed to be a quiet bookstore owner. But he needed to be more than that now. He needed to feel ruthless and powerful, and all of the other things that Carl felt, if he ever hoped to overpower Carl. Overpowering him wasn't a plan exactly. It was a desire, but Joe didn't have the luxury of planning. He had no access to tools or weapons. He was weak and chained to the wall, so there wasn't really much hope of fighting his way out of that house. But he had to hope for something. He had to stay alert and think things through. He needed to pretend that he had an escape plan, because until help arrived, his only other choice would be to submit to whatever plans Carl had for him, and he wasn't willing to do that. Hours had passed since Harvey first led him to believe that help was on its way, but Joe hadn't heard anything since then. The police hadn't busted down the door. There were no gunshots being fired outside the house. All Joe heard was the steady beating of the rain against the basement window. Even the baby had stopped crying. Harvey wasn't anywhere near him, as far as he could tell, though every now and then he could have sworn that he felt the presence of a ghost in the basement with him, keeping itself small and hidden in one of the corners. He couldn't be sure. Everything he felt came in waves, and just when he tried to hold on to one emotion and explore it, he would be struck by another. At times, the sudden change of emotion made him dizzy. He would have to close his eyes and wait for the feeling to pass. He thanked God that he wasn't in the city for this experience. To have that many people piled on top of him would have been hell. The basement door opened, and Carl began to make his way down, slowly and steadily, closing the door behind him. Once Joe could see him, he could see why Carl was being more careful than usual. He was carrying a tray of food with him. Carl smiled when he saw Joe standing and said, "Are the drugs wearing off?" "I'm still weak," Joe replied, feeling no need to lie about his condition. "You probably will for a while longer. How is your hand?" "Broken." A wave of pain washed across Carl's face as he looked down at Joe's injured hand. He told Joe, "I'm sincerely sorry about that. I sometimes find it hard to control my temper." "Me too," Joe replied, trying his best to sound strong and steady, though the emotion of the moment was despair. He wanted to curl up on the floor and go to sleep. He was worthless. He was a defective machine who deserved to die. There was someone standing behind him. He was sure of it. It was as though someone was whispering in his ear, but Carl was the only other person in the room with him. It had to have been a ghost. There was at least one ghost in the house who could come on more subtly than Harvey ever had. Carl held the tray out so that Joe could take a look at the sandwich and cut up pieces of apple that he brought with him. He said, "I've made you lunch. It's not as good as something that Jutta might make, but I've never had much use for a kitchen, so I'm not as skilled a cook." "I'm sure it'll be fine," Joe replied calmly, trying to shake off the feeling of the ghost behind him. His eyes then moved to the object next to his plated sandwich. Resting on a folded napkin, there was another syringe. He couldn't take more drugs. He couldn't tolerate them. He would rather die. And in that moment, he would have welcomed death anyway because he had been such a fool to fall for Leah's tricks. He was a failure. He was a miserable excuse for a human being. "I understand that you probably don't want any more drugs in your system, but as I was making your sandwich, a thought occurred to me. What I gave you before, it wasn't strong enough. You were screaming bits and pieces, but you weren't getting the entire picture." "I didn't see anything." "But you did. You kept repeating it over and over again. They know, they know." I was out of my mind. "No, don't you see? Maybe you don't understand it because you've never truly explored your potential, but your mind was beginning to open up. You were beginning to let go of your desire to keep things from me. I'm not keeping anything from you. The despair was suddenly overshadowed by wonder and awe, possibly coming from Carl. You don't want to be here. You're resisting us because of that fact. But if we can remove that element, then perhaps you will be able to tell me everything. Joe knew that he should want to look Carl in the eyes and tell him that he would rather die than help him. He should resist, but instead, he was curious to find out whether or not Carl's plan would work. He was curious to see what it would be like to have a larger dose and to finally stop holding back, because even when he had tried his hardest to help Leah find her sister, he knew that a part of him was resisting. His skill had always been a weight on his shoulders, and now he had the chance to see what would happen if he simply let go. He knew that these weren't his emotions. Logically, he didn't want to accept the injection. I can see it in your eyes, Carl smiled, truly excited to see Joe as he considered the possibilities. We can work together. Joe pictured Maggie's face in his mind, and the pain of her loss began to spark inside of him. He remembered Norma. He remembered how he had failed them both as a husband and a father. He remembered every regret and every inadequacy. But those feelings, his feelings, were difficult to hold on to. Eat, Carl told him, lifting the plate off of the tray and holding it out for Joe. Joe took the plate with the sandwich and apple slices on it. He looked at the food, still trying his best to focus himself, but each time he grabbed onto those feelings, they slipped away once again. He wondered if by taking the drugs he could gain control of the feelings, no matter how strong. Would he need to focus on bad memories in order to bring himself into focus? Could he handle a ghost that was screaming in his face, or drown it out entirely? What would he be like if he could tap into his full potential? Those feelings were not his own. Carl was the one who was curious. He was the one who wondered at the possibilities. No matter how much Joe might have felt those things, he had to remind himself that they weren't his to feel. He dropped the plate onto the ground, hoping to break Carl's curiosity. As it fell, he could feel the wonder turning into alertness. Both he and Carl reached for the plate, trying to catch it mid-air, but neither was successful. The plate shattered into 100 pieces on the ground, and the sandwich fell apart upon impact. Broken pieces of the plate stuck to the apple slices and fell on top of the mustard-covered pieces of bread and slices of ham. It actually looked like it would have been a nice lunch, and Joe was very hungry, but his goal was to get rid of his desire to take the drugs, and his plan worked. As both men stared at the mess on the floor, they started to fill with anger. It started off small at first, but the longer Carl stared at the broken plate and the pieces of wasted food, the more the anger grew into rage. When Carl looked up at Joe, his fists were balled, and there was fire in his eyes. His breathing sounded more like the snarls of a rabid dog. Joe's lips curled into a grin. His one good hand was balled so tightly into a fist that he worried his fingernails might break skin. His jaw was clenched so tight that he thought his teeth might shatter. Carl lunged toward him, grabbing Joe by the neck and pushing him backward until his back slammed against the wall. He could see the fury inside of Joe, and it only made Carl more angry. Joe grabbed one of Carl's wrists and twisted it, driving his nails through flesh and drawing blood. Even then, he didn't stop squeezing. He couldn't breathe because Carl still had one hand wrapped around his throat, but he squeezed as hard as he could until the skin on Carl's wrist was destroyed. Carl screamed in pain, but would not release Joe's neck. He was trying to pull himself together and regain his composure, but Joe would not allow it. Joe released Carl's damaged arm and tried to pry the hand away from his neck, but he couldn't manage to break Carl's grip. He was feeling weak and desperate for breath, but Carl's grip on his neck remained strong. Blind rage was driving Joe now. He stopped bothering with Carl's hand and turned his attention to Carl's face, jamming his thumb into Carl's left eye until Carl could no longer take the pain and was forced to step back, screaming. Joe didn't waste any time before stepping forward and grabbing Carl by the shoulders as he brought his unchained knee up into Carl's groin. Carl doubled over, gasping for air, and Joe kneed him once again, this time in the face. Carl fell to the ground, but the rage inside of him didn't die. It was growing more desperate by the second. He pulled himself beyond Joe's reach and grabbed the syringe from the tray. Then he got to his feet and looked back at Joe with his bloody face and swelling eye, breathing heavily and cradling his injured wrist in his one good arm. He smiled at Joe, showing his bloody teeth. Joe smiled back. Sam followed the older man out of the AT&T pavilion and into the rain. Thunder roared through the air as the man walked at a quick pace toward the parking lot. Staying close, but not too close, Sam watched the man's arm, which was holding the envelope tight against the man's body, hidden beneath his raincoat. There was no way that the envelope could be allowed to leave that fairground. If Sam lost it, who knew what damage could be done? Harvey had been trying to warn him of something unspeakably evil, and for all Sam knew, that envelope was the key to everything. But what was he supposed to do? Should he tackle this older man right there, in front of everyone at the fair? Should he hit him over the head and grab the envelope, and then make a run for it like a common thief? Maybe the smartest thing to do would be to allow the man to leave and follow him to wherever he lived. Maybe he would lead Sam to the center of whatever German conspiracy was taking place. There was no way Sam could leave, though. Mary would be stranded at the fair with another one of those people, and there would be nobody nearby to help her. As it was, Sam didn't like being separated. He didn't like the idea of Mary following one of those Germans, because if what he was told was correct, the Germans were ruthless. They were willing to kill their own people just for the chance to obtain military or scientific intelligence. If they could kill their own, there was nothing that they wouldn't do to their enemy. In Sam's mind, they could be the most evil human beings on Earth. There was a chance that he was exaggerating their evil, but something in his gut told him that he was standing on the edge of history. Most people knew that it was only a matter of time before war broke out, and maybe this was his chance to damage their cause. Maybe this was his chance to serve his country, just like he always wanted to. But that didn't mean that he would be willing to leave Mary behind. The man with the envelope walked through the gates that led to the parking lot, and Sam knew that if he was going to act, he had to act soon. The parking lot would be the best place for it. He hoped that anyone who hadn't paid the price of admission to the fair before the rain started would have turned around and gone home, and those who had already paid would be inside the fair, waiting out the storm. This would leave fewer witnesses. It was a theory, but it made enough sense to him to make him feel safe attacking the man and taking the envelope by force. Then, if the police were called, maybe they would both be arrested. Sam wouldn't mind spending the night in jail if it meant getting that German behind bars, just as long as Mary was safe. Sam reached into his pocket and wrapped his hand around his keychain, hoping that Harvey was nearby. Even if Harvey couldn't do anything to help him, he preferred not to be alone. He walked through the gates and into the parking lot, but the German man was nowhere to be seen. "If your goal was to be discreet in your pursuit of me, you have failed," came a voice from behind Sam. Turning around, Sam saw the man, standing next to the gate, holding a revolver in his hand, and aiming it directly at him.
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn.